October 4th, 1957. Deep inside the Kremlin, Soviet officials celebrated as their radio signals confirmed success. Sputnik 1, 23 inches wide, 183 pounds, was orbiting Earth at 18,000 miles per hour. America had nothing in space, nothing even close. For the next 4 years, the world watched Soviet triumph after Soviet triumph. First satellite, first man in space, first spacewalk. Every achievement proved one thing: the future belonged to the USSR. In Washington, Pentagon analysts studied classified reports showing the same devastating pattern. Soviet rockets were bigger. Soviet cosmonauts were bolder. Soviet technology was advancing faster than American engineers thought possible. The space race wasn't even close. It was a Soviet victory lap. But 60 miles south of Houston, inside a classified NASA facility, American engineers were building something the Soviets had dismissed as impossible: a rocket 7 times more powerful than anything Moscow possessed. A spacecraft designed not just to orbit Earth, but to land on another world entirely. While Soviet leaders celebrated their dominance in space, they had no idea what was rising from the Texas desert. The Americans weren't trying to catch up in the space race. They were preparing to end it. If you value forgotten history that changed everything, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts of Cold War secrets. Comment your city and local time. We want to know where our stories reach. The radio signals from Sputnik 1 reached Earth every 96 minutes, each transmission confirming what Soviet engineers already knew: they had achieved the impossible. In the sprawling complex of OKB-1, the Secret Design Bureau outside Moscow, Chief designer Sergei Korolev studied the telemetry data with quiet satisfaction. The satellite's batteries would last only 21 days, but those 3 weeks had already rewritten the global balance of power. Korolev had spent 2 decades developing rocket technology, first under Stalin's brutal purges that had cost him 6 years in a labor camp, then through the desperate years of World War II, when Soviet engineers worked around the clock to keep pace with German V-2 rockets. Now, at age 50, he commanded the most advanced space program on Earth. The R-7 Semyorka rocket that had lifted Sputnik into orbit generated over 900,000 pounds of thrust, more than any American rocket in development. Its 20 engines, arranged in clusters around a central core, represented a breakthrough in propulsion engineering that Western analysts were still trying to understand. 3 weeks after Sputnik's launch, President Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting in the White House Cabinet Room. CIA Director Allen Dulles spread reconnaissance photographs across the mahogany table, each image showing the massive launch facilities at Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. The scale of Soviet operations was staggering. Construction crews had built a launch complex covering over 2,500 square miles, complete with assembly buildings that dwarfed anything at Cape Canaveral. American intelligence had underestimated not just Soviet rocket capability, but their entire industrial commitment to space exploration. Defense Secretary Neil McElroy presented the Pentagon's assessment with uncomfortable precision. The Soviet Union now possessed intercontinental ballistic missile technology capable of delivering nuclear warheads to any target in the United States. The same R-7 rocket that had launched Sputnik could carry a 3-megaton hydrogen bomb from Kazakhstan to Washington in 35 minutes. America's Jupiter and Thor missiles, still in testing, could barely reach targets 1,500 miles away. The implications extended far beyond military strategy. In London, Paris, and Rome, Allied governments questioned whether American technology could protect Western Europe from Soviet expansion. Neutral nations in Africa and Asia began viewing the USSR as the rising superpower of the future. Radio Moscow broadcast Sputnik's orbital position twice daily, each transmission a reminder that Soviet science had achieved what American engineers had promised but failed to deliver. Korolev understood the psychological impact better than most Western analysts. During his imprisonment in the Kolyma gold mines, he had watched the Soviet system crush individual initiative while demanding collective achievement. The space program offered a rare opportunity, a chance to demonstrate that Soviet engineering could exceed capitalist innovation through superior organization and state planning. Every successful launch validated the communist model of scientific development. The Vanguard rocket explosion on December 6, 1957, confirmed Soviet superiority in the most public way possible. Television cameras at Cape Canaveral captured the moment when America's answer to Sputnik rose 4 feet off the launch pad before collapsing in a spectacular fireball. The 3-pound satellite, designed to demonstrate American technological prowess, rolled into nearby bushes while its radio beacon continued transmitting a faint signal. International headlines dubbed it Kaputnik and Flopnik, while Soviet newspapers printed photographs of the wreckage alongside images of Sputnik 2, which had successfully carried the dog Laika into orbit just 1 month earlier. Korolev's team had already begun work on Luna 1, a probe designed to impact the moon's surface, in early 1959. The spacecraft would carry Soviet instruments beyond Earth orbit for the first time, proving that Russian rockets possessed the power and precision necessary for interplanetary flight. American engineers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory were attempting similar missions, but their Thor-able rockets had failed 3 consecutive launch attempts. The gap between Soviet achievement and American capability appeared to be widening. Inside the Kremlin, Premier Nikita Khrushchev seized on each space triumph as evidence of communist superiority. The Central Committee allocated additional resources to Korolev's design bureau, approving construction of new launch facilities and authorizing recruitment of the Soviet Union's most talented aerospace engineers. By early 1958, OKB-1 employed over 8,000 specialists working on projects that would maintain Soviet dominance in space for the foreseeable future. The psychological warfare value of the space program exceeded even its military applications. Each successful mission demonstrated that the Soviet Union had surpassed the United States in the most visible arena of technological competition. American newspapers published worried editorials about the missile gap and space lag that threatened Western civilization. Congress demanded explanations for how the nation that had won World War II could fall so far behind its former ally in the race to control the ultimate high ground above Earth. Korolev reviewed classified intelligence reports showing the primitive state of American space efforts. Project Vanguard remained plagued by technical failures, while the Army's Explorer program had managed only 1 successful satellite launch. The Americans possessed neither the rocket engines nor the industrial infrastructure necessary to challenge Soviet leadership in space. Their divided command structure, split between civilian and military agencies, prevented the coordinated effort that had made Soviet success possible. President Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress on May 25, 1961, holding a speech that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of American space efforts. The decision to land a man on the moon before the decade's end represented more than political rhetoric. It required a complete transformation of NASA's operational priorities and budget allocations. Kennedy had consulted extensively with Vice President Johnson, who chaired the Space Council, and NASA Administrator James Webb, who had provided detailed cost estimates exceeding $20 billion over 8 years. The announcement came just 3 weeks after Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin completed a full orbit of Earth in Vostok 1. American intelligence agencies had tracked the flight through radio intercepts and radar monitoring, confirming that Korolev's team had achieved another technological milestone that left the United States years behind in human spaceflight capability. Gagarin's 108-minute mission demonstrated Soviet mastery of life support systems, spacecraft guidance, and recovery operations that NASA was still developing on paper. At the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, Wernher von Braun received Kennedy's lunar landing directive with calculated optimism, tempered by engineering reality. Braun's team had been developing the Saturn rocket series since 1958, but the current Saturn I configuration generated only 1.5 million pounds of thrust, insufficient for lunar missions. The moon landing would require a completely new vehicle capable of lifting 50 tons of spacecraft and fuel beyond Earth orbit, demanding rocket engines that did not yet exist in American inventory. Von Braun understood the technical challenges more clearly than most NASA officials. Lunar missions required 3 distinct phases: Earth orbit departure, lunar orbit insertion, and surface landing with subsequent return capability. Each phase demanded different propulsion systems, navigation computers, and life support equipment. The Apollo spacecraft would need to function reliably in the radiation environment beyond Earth's magnetic field, operate in the vacuum of lunar orbit, and execute a precision landing on terrain that remained largely unmapped by terrestrial telescopes. The German rocket engineer's wartime experience with the V-2 program had taught him the importance of systematic testing and incremental development. The Nazi rocket project had achieved remarkable technical success through methodical engineering approaches, despite operating under the pressures of total war. Von Braun applied these same principles to Saturn rocket development, insisting on multiple test flights for each configuration before progressing to more complex missions. Soviet intelligence services tracked American lunar preparations through multiple channels, including technical journals, congressional budget hearings, and reconnaissance satellites. KGB analysts reported to Moscow that NASA was recruiting aerospace engineers from universities and defense contractors at unprecedented rates, expanding facilities across multiple states, and procuring specialized equipment for lunar mission training. The scale of American commitment suggested serious intent to challenge Soviet space leadership through a dramatic technological demonstration. Korolev recognized the strategic implications of Kennedy's lunar challenge, but faced significant technical obstacles in developing Soviet lunar capability. The R-7 rocket that had powered early Soviet successes lacked sufficient payload capacity for direct lunar missions. Soviet engineers would need to develop either a much larger rocket or master the complex orbital rendezvous techniques required for multi-launch lunar missions. Both approaches required years of development time that might allow American programs to close the technological gap. The Central Committee authorized increased funding for lunar research, but demanded that Korolev maintain Soviet leadership in Earth orbital missions while simultaneously developing moon landing capability. This dual requirement stretched engineering resources and divided attention between competing priorities. Korolev's design bureau was already managing multiple projects, including improved Vostok spacecraft, automated lunar probes, and experimental Soyuz vehicles for future missions. By late 1961, American industrial mobilization for the Apollo program was generating measurable results. The Boeing company received contracts for Saturn rocket first stages. North American Aviation began developing the Apollo command module, and Grumman Aircraft started preliminary design work on the lunar landing vehicle. NASA's budget increased from $500 million in 1960 to over $3 billion by 1963, representing the largest peacetime technological undertaking in American history. Von Braun's engineering teams at Marshall made crucial breakthroughs in rocket engine clustering and staging techniques during 1962 and 1963. The F-1 engine, developed by Rocketdyne, would generate 1.5 million pounds of thrust using liquid oxygen and kerosene propellants. 5 F-1 engines clustered together would power the Saturn V first stage with sufficient thrust to lift the complete Apollo spacecraft toward lunar orbit. Test firing programs confirmed the engine's reliability and performance specifications by 1964. Soviet lunar efforts encountered more serious obstacles during the same period. The N-1 rocket, designed to match Saturn V capabilities, required 30 engines in its first stage, a configuration that complicated fuel distribution, engine synchronization, and failure management systems. Korolev's team struggled to achieve the precise timing necessary for simultaneous engine ignition and thrust vector control across so many propulsion units. American reconnaissance satellites began detecting Soviet lunar testing activities at Baikonur Cosmodrome by 1963, including construction of new launch complexes and assembly buildings sized for vehicles much larger than existing R-7 rockets. CIA analysts concluded that the USSR was developing lunar mission capability, but remained uncertain about Soviet technical progress and launch schedules. The competition had evolved beyond simple Earth orbital demonstrations to a race for the most ambitious target in human space exploration. Both superpowers were committing unprecedented resources to lunar programs, but their different approaches to rocket design and mission planning would determine which nation achieved Kennedy's goal of landing humans on the moon before 1970. The Apollo 7 mission launched from Cape Kennedy on October 11, 1968, carrying astronauts Walter Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walter Cunningham into Earth orbit for an 11-day shakedown flight of the redesigned Apollo command module. NASA engineers had spent 20 months rebuilding the spacecraft's electrical systems, hatch mechanisms, and atmospheric controls following the Apollo 1 fire that had killed 3 astronauts during a ground test in January 1967. The tragedy had forced a complete reassessment of Apollo safety procedures and delayed lunar mission plans by nearly 2 years. Schirra's crew conducted extensive tests of the command module's navigation computers, life support systems, and docking procedures that would be essential for lunar missions. The spacecraft performed flawlessly during 163 orbits, proving that NASA had successfully redesigned the Apollo systems for long-duration spaceflight. Mission controllers at Houston monitored every system parameter, confirming that the command module could sustain 3 astronauts for the 8-day lunar mission profile. 6 weeks later, Apollo 8 achieved a breakthrough that surprised both American space officials and Soviet intelligence analysts. Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders became the first humans to leave Earth orbit when their Saturn V rocket fired them toward the Moon on December 21, 1968. The mission represented a calculated risk by NASA administrators who had accelerated the lunar program timeline to maintain Kennedy's end-of-decade deadline, despite technical delays from the Apollo 1 setback. The Saturn V rocket performed exactly as von Braun's engineering teams had predicted. The first stage's 5 F1 engines generated 7.6 million pounds of thrust, lifting the complete Apollo spacecraft away from Earth with sufficient velocity to reach lunar orbit in 3 days. The third stage SIVB engine then fired for 5 minutes and 17 seconds, adding the precise amount of energy necessary to escape Earth's gravitational field and coast toward the Moon at 25,000 miles per hour. Soviet tracking stations monitored Apollo 8's progress across the 3-day transit, confirming American mastery of deep space navigation and spacecraft systems management. Korolev had died 2 years earlier from complications related to his imprisonment in Stalin's labor camps, leaving the Soviet lunar program under the direction of Vasily Mishin, who lacked his predecessor's political influence and engineering intuition. Mishin's team was still struggling with N-1 rocket development problems that had prevented any successful test flights of their lunar vehicle. Apollo 8 entered lunar orbit on Christmas Eve 1968, becoming the first crewed spacecraft to orbit another celestial body. The astronauts conducted photographic surveys of potential landing sites in the Sea of Tranquility and Ocean of Storms, while mission controllers in Houston calculated orbital mechanics for the return trajectory. The spacecraft's service propulsion system fired precisely on schedule to break lunar orbit and begin the 3-day coast back to Earth. The mission's success demonstrated American capability in every major technical area required for lunar landing missions. NASA had proven that Saturn V rockets could deliver Apollo spacecraft to the Moon, that astronauts could survive extended deep space flights, and that navigation computers could execute the complex orbital maneuvers necessary for lunar operations. Only the actual landing and surface operations remained to be tested before attempting the complete mission profile. Grumman Aircraft Corporation's lunar module reached final testing phases during the same period, with engineering teams completing structural tests, guidance system integration, and propulsion system verification. The spacecraft represented a radical departure from conventional aircraft design, optimized exclusively for operations in the lunar vacuum with no aerodynamic requirements. The descent stage carried 11,000 pounds of propellant for the powered landing, while the ascent stage contained enough fuel to lift 2 astronauts back to lunar orbit for rendezvous with the command module. Soviet lunar efforts encountered increasingly serious obstacles throughout 1968 and early 1969. The first N-1 test flight exploded 69 seconds after launch in February 1969, destroying the launch pad and setting back Soviet lunar ambitions by at least 18 months. The rocket's first stage required 30 NK-15 engines operating in precise coordination, but Soviet engineers had never successfully demonstrated such complex engine clustering systems. Each failure required extensive investigation and design modifications that consumed time the lunar program could not afford. American intelligence agencies tracked Soviet lunar activities through multiple sources, including signals intercepts, photographic reconnaissance, and technical analysis of debris from failed launches. CIA assessments concluded that the USSR was experiencing significant technical difficulties with their lunar rocket development, potentially creating an opportunity for American programs to achieve decisive superiority in the space race. Apollo 9 launched on March 3, 1969, carrying the first lunar module into Earth orbit for comprehensive testing of landing systems and crew transfer procedures. Astronauts James McDivitt, David Scott, and Russell Schweickart spent 10 days conducting rendezvous operations, docking maneuvers, and spacewalks that simulated the complete lunar landing mission profile. The lunar module's descent and ascent engines performed flawlessly during multiple firings, confirming the spacecraft's readiness for actual lunar operations. The mission validated NASA's lunar orbit rendezvous strategy, which required the command module and lunar module to separate in lunar orbit, conduct independent operations on the lunar surface and in orbit, then reunite for the return journey to Earth. This approach demanded precise navigation, reliable communications, and backup procedures for every critical phase of the mission. Apollo 9 demonstrated that American astronauts and spacecraft could execute these complex operations with the accuracy necessary for lunar landing success. By spring 1969, NASA was preparing for Apollo 10, a full dress rehearsal that would take the complete Apollo spacecraft to lunar orbit and descend to within 50,000 feet of the Moon's surface without actually landing. The mission would test every system and procedure except the final landing sequence itself, providing the last verification before attempting humanity's first lunar landing with Apollo 11. Apollo 10 launched on May 18, 1969, carrying Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan on the final rehearsal before the actual lunar landing attempt. The mission profile duplicated every aspect of the lunar landing sequence except the final descent to the Moon's surface, testing spacecraft systems and crew procedures under actual lunar conditions rather than Earth orbit simulations. NASA administrators needed confirmation that both the command module and lunar module could operate reliably in the radiation environment and gravitational fields they would encounter during the landing mission. Stafford and Cernan descended in the lunar module to within 8.4 miles of the Sea of Tranquility, closer to the lunar surface than any humans had traveled. The descent engine fired for 27 seconds, reducing their orbital velocity and bringing them into the same flight path that Apollo 11 would follow to the landing site. Ground controllers at Houston monitored every system parameter as the lunar module flew over the planned landing area, confirming that navigation computers could maintain accurate positioning and that communication systems functioned properly at low altitude. The ascent stage separation test nearly ended in disaster when a switch malfunction caused the lunar module to tumble wildly for 8 seconds before Stafford regained control. The spacecraft had been programmed to jettison the descent stage and fire the ascent engine, but incorrect guidance settings caused violent oscillations that could have torn the vehicle apart. Stafford's quick manual intervention stabilized the spacecraft and completed the rendezvous with Young in the command module, but the incident highlighted potential failure modes that could prove fatal during an actual landing mission. NASA engineers conducted extensive analysis of the Apollo 10 anomaly, tracing the problem to a guidance computer switch that had been left in the wrong position during pre-flight preparations. The error would have been catastrophic during a real landing mission, potentially stranding astronauts on the lunar surface if the ascent stage had been damaged or destroyed. Flight directors implemented additional checklist procedures and backup systems to prevent similar malfunctions during Apollo 11. Soviet intelligence services monitored Apollo 10 communications and tracked the spacecraft's orbital mechanics throughout the mission, confirming American capability to execute precision lunar operations with remarkable accuracy. KGB technical analysts reported that NASA had demonstrated all the systems and procedures necessary for successful lunar landings, leaving only the actual surface operations to be proven. The comprehensive nature of Apollo 10's mission profile indicated that American lunar landing attempts would begin within months. Vasily Mishin's lunar program faced increasingly desperate circumstances during the same period. The second N-1 test flight exploded on July 3, 1969, just 11 seconds after launch when vibrations caused multiple engine failures in the first stage. The massive explosion completely destroyed the launch pad at Baikonur and scattered debris across several square miles of the cosmodrome. Soviet officials realized that their lunar rocket would require at least 2 more years of development before achieving operational status, effectively ending any hope of beating American lunar landing efforts. The N-1 failures revealed fundamental design problems that Soviet engineers had been unable to resolve despite years of development work. The rocket's 31st stage engines created complex vibration patterns and fuel flow dynamics that proved impossible to control with existing Soviet guidance systems. Each engine required precise thrust adjustment to maintain vehicle stability, but the necessary computer systems and control algorithms exceeded Soviet technological capabilities in 1969. American preparations for Apollo 11 proceeded according to the accelerated schedule established after Apollo 10's success. Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins began intensive training for the lunar landing mission, practicing landing procedures in simulators that duplicated every aspect of the actual spacecraft systems. Armstrong logged over 50 hours in the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, a rocket-powered aircraft that simulated the lunar module's flight characteristics in Earth's atmosphere. The Saturn V rocket assigned to Apollo 11 underwent final assembly and testing at Cape Kennedy during June 1969. Each stage received comprehensive systems checks, propellant loading tests, and guidance computer integration verification. Von Braun's quality control procedures required documentation of every component and subsystem before declaring the vehicle ready for flight. The rocket represented the culmination of 8 years of development work and over $4 billion in research and manufacturing investments. Soviet space officials quietly shifted their focus from lunar landing missions to Earth orbital space station projects during summer 1969. The Salyut program offered opportunities to demonstrate long-duration spaceflight capabilities and scientific research applications that could compete with American achievements in different areas. However, this strategic pivot represented an acknowledgement that Soviet space technology could no longer match American capabilities in the most prestigious arena of space exploration. NASA announced the Apollo 11 launch date of July 16, 1969, with the lunar landing scheduled for July 20th, if all mission phases proceeded according to plan. The announcement generated worldwide attention as governments, news organizations, and scientific institutions prepared to monitor humanity's first attempt to land on another celestial body. Technical observers estimated the mission's success probability at approximately 70% based on the complexity of the operations involved and the limited experience with actual lunar surface conditions. Intelligence assessments from both American and Soviet sources confirmed that no other nation possessed the technological capability to attempt lunar landing missions in the foreseeable future. The space race had evolved into a direct competition between two superpowers with the resources and industrial capacity necessary for such ambitious undertakings. Apollo 11 would determine whether American engineering and project management could overcome the early Soviet advantages that had dominated space exploration throughout the previous decade. The mission represented more than a technological demonstration. It would validate the effectiveness of democratic societies in organizing and executing complex scientific projects that required sustained commitment and massive resource allocation over extended periods. Apollo 11 lifted off from Launch Pad 39A at 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 16, 1969, with Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins aboard the command module Columbia. The Saturn V rocket performed flawlessly during the 11-minute ascent, placing the Apollo spacecraft into Earth parking orbit at an altitude of 115 miles. Mission controllers at Houston verified all systems before authorizing the trans-lunar injection burn that would send the crew toward their rendezvous with the Moon. Armstrong had trained extensively for the lunar landing sequence, logging hundreds of hours in simulators that replicated every aspect of the lunar module's flight characteristics and control systems. His background as a test pilot provided experience with experimental aircraft and emergency procedures that proved essential for the mission's most critical phase. The lunar module Eagle would separate from the command module in lunar orbit, descend to the surface with Armstrong and Aldrin aboard, while Collins maintained orbital operations as the crew's link to Earth. Soviet tracking stations monitored Apollo 11's progress during the three-day transit to the Moon, confirming the spacecraft's trajectory and communication schedules. Premier Leonid Brezhnev had ordered extensive coverage of American lunar activities, though Soviet media downplayed the significance of the mission in public broadcasts. Internal government assessments acknowledged that successful American lunar landings would demonstrate clear technological superiority in the most visible arena of superpower competition. The lunar module separated from the command module on July 20th at 1:44 p.m. Eastern Time, beginning the powered descent toward the Sea of Tranquility landing site. Armstrong and Aldrin fired the descent engine for 12 minutes and 36 seconds, reducing their velocity from 3,800 feet per second to zero as they approached the lunar surface. The automatic guidance system directed them toward the planned landing coordinates, but Armstrong assumed manual control during the final approach when he observed boulder fields that could damage the spacecraft. Armstrong's manual flying extended the powered descent beyond planned fuel consumption, leaving only 25 seconds of propellant remaining when Eagle touched down at Tranquility Base. The landing sequence had consumed nearly all available fuel reserves, but the spacecraft's structure remained intact and all systems functioned normally. Mission controllers confirmed successful surface operations as Armstrong reported their status from the lunar surface at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time. The first human footstep on the Moon occurred at 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time as Armstrong descended from the lunar module and stepped onto the surface. His statement about one small step for man becoming one giant leap for mankind was broadcast live to television audiences estimated at over 600 million viewers worldwide. The transmission quality was poor due to technical limitations of the television equipment, but the historic significance of the moment transcended the grainy black and white images. Aldrin joined Armstrong on the surface 19 minutes later, beginning a planned 2-hour and 31-minute exploration of the immediate landing area. The astronauts collected 47 pounds of lunar rock and soil samples, deployed scientific instruments, including a seismometer and laser reflector, and conducted photographic surveys of the terrain. Their movements in the Moon's 1/6 gravity required constant attention to maintain balance and avoid damaging their life support equipment. The lunar surface operations proceeded according to mission plans, despite several minor equipment malfunctions and communication delays caused by the 250,000-mile distance to Earth. Armstrong and Aldrin planted an American flag, left commemorative plaques and medallions, and spoke with President Nixon via radio telephone from the lunar surface. Their activities demonstrated human capability to work effectively in the lunar environment for extended periods. Soviet space officials acknowledged American success in lunar landing operations through carefully worded statements that emphasized the scientific value of the mission while avoiding direct comparisons to Soviet space achievements. Internal assessments recognized that the United States had achieved decisive superiority in space technology and project management capabilities. The N-1 rocket failures had eliminated any possibility of matching American lunar accomplishments in the foreseeable future. The ascent from the lunar surface began at 1:54 p.m. Eastern Time on July 21st, with the Eagle's upper stage firing its engine for 7 minutes and 4 seconds to reach lunar orbit for rendezvous with Collins in the command module. The ascent engine performed exactly as designed, lifting Armstrong and Aldrin away from Tranquility Base and into the trajectory calculated for orbital mechanics. Collins had maintained station keeping in lunar orbit throughout the surface operations, ready to execute rescue procedures if the ascent failed. Docking between the lunar module and command module occurred at 5:35 p.m. Eastern Time, completing the most complex rendezvous operation ever attempted. The crew transferred lunar samples and equipment into Columbia before jettisoning the Eagle ascent stage to crash into the lunar surface. The trans-Earth injection burn fired at 12:56 a.m. Eastern Time on July 22nd, beginning the 3-day coast back to Earth. Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean at 12:50 p.m. Eastern Time on July 24th, completing the 8-day mission that fulfilled Kennedy's commitment to land Americans on the Moon before the decade ended. The crew underwent 21 days of medical quarantine as a precaution against potential lunar contamination, though scientists considered the risk minimal. Analysis of lunar samples confirmed the Moon's composition and geological history, while proving that human exploration of other worlds was technologically feasible. The mission's success validated American aerospace engineering, project management, and industrial capabilities on a scale that impressed both allies and adversaries. NASA had demonstrated that democratic societies could organize and execute complex technological projects that required sustained effort and massive resource commitments over extended periods. The achievement marked a decisive shift in Cold War perceptions of American technological leadership and renewed confidence in Western scientific and engineering capabilities.